Well, I know there's still people coming in, but we're going to start. So the first panel basically dealt with what happened at 5 o'clock this morning. Now we're going to take, zoom out and take a view of what happened in the last year in the South China Sea. We've got a great panel. We're going to follow them in the order in the booklet that you received. And I'll introduce people serially. So our first speaker is Rear Admiral Michael Mcdevitt, retired from the U.S. Navy, who is now a senior fellow in strategic studies at CNA Corp. Michael?
Thanks, Murray. My perspective is, of course, on U.S. policy, both of what has happened in the recent past as well as a little bit of speculation about the future. But first, a thought occurs to me during the first excellent panel. From a policymaker's perspective, what are the implications of the finding of the arbitration? It seems to me what it has done, it has stripped away any uncertainty in terms of things like the 9-dash line, overlapping EEZ delimitation issues, and what have you. And whereas the U.S. itself might have had opinions as to China or anybody else's activity being unlawful, now we have, if you will, a second opinion, a pretty influential second opinion. And so does that lead U.S. policymakers in the direction of being more explicit in calling out, let's say, China, for example, for, quote, specific unlawful activities in the South China Sea, something that Washington has only tiptoed around in the past. And so this is, I think, the huge elephant in the policy room anyway, to think about how these findings are translated into, for the case of the United States, into U.S. policy statements and positions and what have you. My paper, which is, I would encourage you all to read. I spent a lot of time working on it, although much of it has become overtaken by events, is entitled The Growing Role of Defense, of the Defense Department in South China Sea Policy. And I think the best example of the growing role of security, if you will, or DoD-related issues is, in fact, the constant invocation we hear of the U.S. will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. I love it. It's succinct, it's unambiguous, but it's also very hard-nosed, and it's a hard-nosed statement of traditional interest. And really what it is saying sub rosa to all of the people around the region who say, well, China's pushing the United States out and what have you. What it's really saying is the United States can do these things and no one can do anything about it unless they want to start a war to use force to prevent us from doing so. That's what that statement really means. And so this is an incredibly powerful statement, I think, about how to characterize in a very short line what the U.S. view of not only just in the South China Sea, but maritime rights around the world. So my argument is essentially that if you will, the tougher defense or security-oriented approach to U.S. policy in the South China Sea, to use an aphorism, the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of the U.S. policy community was island building. Up to that point, the United States had generally ignored U.S. State Department blandishments that encouraged moderation, encouraged getting on with the code of conduct, et cetera, et cetera. And that seemed to be the tipping point when you look back. And going back just a little bit further, to put a specific piece on this, since August of 2013, the U.S. Navy has maintained more or less two U.S. destroyers full-time in the South China Sea. On average, according to Navy data that I found in a statement, around 700 ship days of U.S. Navy presence per annum in the South China Sea. Lots of exercises, lots of port visits, and what have you. So U.S. presence has dramatically ramped up over the last 2 years in the South China Sea. So the island building issue really, from America's point of view, changed the strategic balance in the Spratlys in a very significant way. Between 1988 and 2014, you could characterize all of the different garrisons there in the Spratly Islands, that all the different countries had there, as kind of a live and let live situation. Well, the island building really tipped the balance in a way that has facilitated a militarily intimidating presence. Quite frankly, I've looked at all of the overhead pictures that you've seen, and Admiral Senator Sullivan put a picture of Fiery Cross Reef up there, and I looked at it. But what really got my attention was a recent satellite photograph that showed a picture of a 25,000-ton PLA Navy amphibious ship. It's 700 feet long, tied up along the pier or one of the quay walls there in Fiery Cross Reef, and you could barely make it out, given in the size of the harbor. So that is a big facility. And you can and remember that amphibious ship alone can carry between 500 and 800 PLA soldiers or Marines. We probably don't want to have to re-argue the freedom of navigation operations, except to say that one was conducted in September of 2015 on Subi Reef, one in January of 2016 in the Paracels against Triton Island, and then in 2016 against Fiery Cross Reef. And that, I think, is the one that drew the strongest response from Beijing. It said it was threatening China's sovereignty. Now, I wish Senator Sullivan was here, because I think he has slipped into the problem that a lot of people have somehow conflated the idea of a freedom of navigation operation with some sort of a deterrent operation. It is not intended, or at least as freedom of navigation operations were originally conceived, were not intended to be a militarily deterring or intimidating action. It was meant to be a physical manifestation of a diplomatic protest or objection to an excessive claim. And unfortunately, when people say, we need to have more freedom of navigation operations, or give me 20 pounds more of freedom of navigation operations, they're conflating deterrence, standard good old-fashioned U.S. presence to either reassure an ally or to dissuade something bad from happening, with freedom of navigation, and it's a bad road to go down. Scarborough Shoal is perhaps the most interesting change in U.S. policy. All of a sudden became a huge issue this spring. March, April, May, we had a carrier battle group operating more or less full-time around Scarborough Shoal. Why? Apparently, the U.S. had very good information that China was intending to turn Scarborough Shoal into another Fiery Cross Reef. In other words, they're going to do island building, and this was an attempt through U.S. presence to dissuade China. It wasn't just U.S. presidents, according to the the New York Times. President Obama brought it up with President Xi on the margins of the nuclear security summit held here in Washington not too very long ago. And so it leads you to believe that the United States has decided that Scarborough is different. It's not in the Spratlys, it's not in the Paracels, and if you look at the legal reasoning, the sovereignty claims of the Philippines and China, I've convinced myself, anyway, that the Philippines have a better claim. And the U.S. is acting, although we haven't said that, the U.S. is acting like we believe that. And so one of the interesting things, not only in the past but in the future, is Scarborough Shoal going to be pulled out of the we don't take any position on sovereignty claim issue in the South China Sea and looked at the more or less sui generis piece of that the U.S. could say this is kind of like the Senkakus, that maybe we should extend the Mutual Defense Treaty from with the Philippines over Scarborough Shoal as a deterrent measure to make sure that island building doesn't take place. I'm not predicting that. What I'm saying, though, is I think the recent finding didn't from the arbitral panel didn't decide who Scarborough belongs to. All it decided was it was a rock, and so we still don't know whose rock it is. But the issue is, will the U.S. see this because of our reaction already made that this has particular strategic significance? The view graph that Senator Sullivan put up on the screen that showed the importance of Scarborough as compared to radar coverage over Luzon and what have you, I think is significant. So that's kind of Mcdevitt's assessment of stay tuned. We don't know what's going to happen yet on Scarborough. The Paracel's got its moment in the sun this past spring when there was a flurry of activity about the Paracels having new surface-to-air missiles and anti-ship cruise missiles and extending runways, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In this case, the Paracels have a really important strategic position as far as China is concerned. They provide the screen for the Sanya Naval Base on Hainan, where their SSBNs, their submarines that carry ballistic missiles, ballistic missile submarines are. And so that's defense in depth for China. So we should not be surprised, particularly since U.S. surveillance fly the international airspace between the Paracels and Hainan Island routinely, that China is very concerned about that piece of territory. So I think my time is up. Murray's giving me an evil eye there, so I'm gonna stop there. I think that we have to spend a lot of time sorting out what the implications of the panel findings are for U.S. policy as well as anybody else's policy. But to me, the biggest thing is it strips away uncertainty, strips away the 9-dash line, strips away overlapping EEZs from the Spratlys to the Philippines or to Malaysia or even Indonesia at Natuna. And so how is that going to be actually exercised in practice? Is the Chinese Coast Guard and Maritime Militia going to continue to do what they have been doing? Are they going to continue to harass contractors that the government of the Philippines hire to explore and read table mount and what have you? So those are great uncertainties. So this is just the beginning of the journey, not the end of it, I think.
Great, thanks, Mike. Our next speaker is Shenden Li, who is the Vice Dean of the Institute of International Affairs at Fudan University in Shanghai. Professor?
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be invited. As the previous Chinese panelist started with congratulations to Philippines, I think we see the end of first act, which seemed to be a failure of China. New York Times has mentioned kind of devastating refuting. But I also would say this is the start of a second act, an uncertain act. It could open a better future or could open a more destabilizing future. With the same UNCLOS, different stakeholders have different understanding what it means. China considers that given the dispute over sovereignty, the Permanent Court has no right to accept the lawsuit. But the court considers that it's wrong. Given this particular case, it still has its right to decide. And the right to decide whether the court has right to accept is with the court, not with any member of the UNCLOS, which China may not understand. Then the ruling. China seems to lose all points. China may not be recognized for what it called as island. China may not be entitled to some inner water, territorial water, or EEZ, and the splatly is not justified to be viewed as an entirety. So it does not justify, like Diaoyu Island, to have inner water and baseline territorial water. China does not say Diaoyu Island has EEZ, but China clearly says this morning, the foreign minister said, we have EEZ over Spratly. So there is vast different understanding and a disagreement. So Mao Zedong used to say, 大乱达到大治. A bigger chaos may lead to a bigger governance. I hope we would open a second act with a good governance. We may not accept the ruling, the verdict, as China say, no recognition, no participation, no acceptance, and no execution. But we still may respect the technical points, the mechanical points, how we understand each article, each word, and how they apply to each case. So over time, all of us sitting here would grow to be a legal expert, especially a maritime legal expert. At least for me, I was not. I was an arms control researcher, but over time, I tried to transform myself to be a legal expert on those complicated maritime issues. I will still read the Chinese version and English version word by word, line by line, paragraph by paragraph, to understand totally why they would say this, and why we disagree, why they may make a point, why they fail to take care of China's sensible points. I don't see a big difference between China and the US, especially both countries supports peaceful settlement of disputes. For the Taiwan issue, US said peaceful settlement. And then China no longer say liberate Taiwan. We say we would exercise our maximum effort to have peaceful for unification. We did not say peaceful settlement. We say settlement is unification. But our maximum effort, we cannot prelude the possibility of unpeaceful formula. And given international disputes, there are many peaceful means. Talk, negotiation, consultation, mediation, arbitration, all sorts before war fighting. And China talked to Vietnam to settle the the land dispute and the Tonkin Bay, Beibuwan dispute. And the ROC used to draw 11 lines, not a 9-dash line, 11-dash line. PRC, without consulting with Taiwan, unilaterally deleted the 2 lines, which means lines can be deleted. So look at this. I disagree, line can be deleted, but 2 lines have been deleted anyway. So when you have a certain mentality, you can do things that you would not allow yourself to do at a later time. When you vow not to do now, you may be flexible at a future time. So when we make a friendship with Vietnam, if we still have that two dash line, they will be unhappy. And we may have given to Vietnam an island on our side of that particular two lines. When we say we are entitled to all island and reefs, this is our unalienable territory, we give at least one of them to Vietnam, as long as it is good for friendship and peace. I hope this spirit will long live with us in the future. Territory is not that important. Peace is more important. Land for peace. If an island would make a peace between Vietnam and China, we should be flexible. We should not condemn the older leader. They used to yield sovereignty. But that happened at a time when we were very ideologic, when we do not have WeChat. WeChat makes things impossible, make diplomacy less possible. That entails even greater command of statecraft between China and other stakeholders to show our greater sincerity. We want peace. Land can be traded, but not one-sided, two-way. 真诚惠容, mutual benefit, not a one-sided benefit. So Filipinos' new president, Duterte, seemed to say, if the ruling could not make a change in 2 years, he is willing to return to talk, because the purpose is to settle. And if the ruling as one peaceful means cannot resolve the problem, we still have other alternative ways of peaceful approach. So ruling is one approach that did not work between US and Nicaragua. Why it has to work between China and the Philippines? I'm not saying because the US used to do that, we should repeat. I was saying someone used to do it may not tell us that we must do things different from the old formula. But we are still descendants of Confucius. Don't repeat what we think were wrongly done by them. We should do better. So I warmly welcome Filipinos leader to visit China, and the Chinese leader visit Philippines to promote 一带一路, one belt, one road. Without settling the dispute, we can do something else. Without settling the Taiwan question, we were trading a lot with Taiwan and doing lots of business with America. We don't need to have this to be settled so as to start other business. This is important, but it is resolvable as long as we're willing to resolve. Court ruling is great, but not perfect, because China still does not understand some of the articles, and the court may be unable to understand the Chinese statement. So when we talk, we are flexible. We say, you take, we give. They say, you take, we give. By taking and giving, we are not bound by the ruling. When you go to the court, you are bound. A big country tend to be confident, tend to be unilateral, tend not to be bound by a third party, which would dictate to you that you have to do it. I hope over time, major country would be flexible with this. Chinese religion says, give means taking. When you give, you take. When you take, you give. No one would be able to take everything. When you take, you morally lose. When you give, you morally you win the hearts of many others. So I think let's take all means of peaceful settlement. Talk, mediation. Someone sitting in this room may propose, I want to be a bridger between China and the Philippines. Mediate. Henry Kissinger used to get Nobel Peace Prize through mediating between Palestine and Israel. Not a court ruling, but mediating. And we have not tried this approach. We may not prelude going to the court. But the easiest way is to have direct talk or multilateral talk. So for this year, 2016, Foreign Minister Wang Yi has already shown his flexibility by changing Chinese position of bilateral talk to a dual track, 双轨制, that talk which shows China can change. 2 or 3 years ago, China said, no way. Now China say, dual track. And maybe 3 years later, China say, three track. So as long as China considers that by being moderate and flexible would benefit China, China is smart. So I would not say China would not change. But our friend may show their flexibility as well by not only sticking to arbitration, but combining arbitration and bilateral talk. This way, we do win-win. And we may open a promising Act 2, rather than condemning China, forcing China to show its hardline position and to honor its promise to implement its hardline promise. That would make everybody to lose. China and US share a lot in common, peaceful settlement, as well as freedom of navigation. Over time, Chinese plan of all sorts would exercise freedom of navigation. In others' space, which is close to them, or sail into the water which is close to them, either by the term which is called innocent passage, or the term freedom of navigation. Don't feel annoyed if China would do a lot of this. And all other are preaching would make them at a future time to be regretful. I hope China would not be aggressive as America is doing now, going to Iraq without admitting its mistake. UK has already admitted that it's a wrong war, and Tony Blair is to be responsible. America has no gut to have its political correctness that America unnecessarily entered the country without evidence, without a UN authorization, but to invade, to create 350,000 death tolls, which would justify the ICC to initiate its process. China has not been a member. China does not qualify to sue the US, which is also not a member. Let's join ICC, suing each other. No one should go to another country to kill without evidence and without UN Security Council resolutions manding. America has not ratified UNCLOS. America is selling weapons to Taiwan. I don't know what is the justification that the Taiwan Relation Act, the domestic law, is more superior than international law, which is just the UN Charter. Unless the US would say Taiwan is not a part of China. But the US is unwilling to say this. So let's say we all have some area where others see a weakness. And we all have our problem not to admit that we have room to improve. As a major country, US, China, they should work together peacefully to make peace. And they should lead the world by improving themselves As James mentioned, as the Senator mentioned, America should make it strong at home. We should make us strong by respecting all means of peaceful settlement of international dispute. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shen. Our next speaker is Nguyen Vu Tum, who is the acting president of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, and many of us remember him fondly when he was also DCM for the Vietnam Embassy here in Washington. Tum, over to you.
Thank you, Murray. I'm now wearing the track 2 hat instead of wearing the track 1 hat that I used to wear a few years back. First of all, I'd like to thank the CSIS team in inviting me to take part in this very important forum. And I believe that this series of conferences has become a trademark for your group, and I really congratulate you for that. My presentation would consist of 4 main parts. One is the development of the South China Sea over the last year. 2 is the development related to South China Sea. And the third one is the impact of this development to regional strategic landscape. And part 4 is about the anticipation of the next moves. I think that with regard to the development on the South China Sea, over the last year, we didn't have something like a high-profile incident like the oil rig incident in 2014. But the developments are so worrisome, telling us that the South China Sea issue is not going away. It continues to be a hotspot in the region with the developments of scope and intensity that have serious strategic implications. I would like to name a few of the developments that we are really concerned about. The first one is the land reclamation. And it seems to me that it has entered the phase 2 when the land reclamation has been a little bit more quiet, but the construction and installation of facilities has become more visible. Next is the militarization of this reclaimed feature with more force and weapon systems deployments and naval exercises both on Spratly and Paracel areas. The next development is the utility of fishing boats supported by Coast Guard and naval forces in the Spratly areas, especially with deep intrusion into Malaysia and Indonesia EEZ. And together with that is the harsh treatment of some Southeast Asian countries' fishermen, including Vietnam and the Philippines. And we also have to note, like Mike has mentioned, the FON-OP operation by the U.S. Navy. So the highlight is that China has consolidated physical presence in the area, and it has changed the status quo and the balance of force on the ground. And I would like to go a little bit further than Mike's by saying that China now has been able to project power in the sea at the pace and at the timing it wants. We also witnessed the development related to South China Sea, and I would like to name some of the most visible ones. The first is the Philippines versus China arbitration case that we have the ruling out today. Secondly, COC and DOC. We have seen almost no progress on that matter because the own parties, on the one hand, claim a pledge to aim at an early conclusion of COC and effective implementation of DOC, but we have witnessed almost no progress. Then we also see the ASEAN's consolidated position on South China Sea, as seen in the joint ministerial meeting between ASEAN and China. We see the stronger wording in the consensus document by ASEAN, but we at the same time also see the failure of ASEAN to introduce it, at least on the ASEAN Secretariat website. We also see the G7 having stronger wording about the South China Sea, as well as we saw the South China Sea developments infiltrating into the bilateral relations, such as the Vietnam-U.S. relations and U.S.-China, Vietnam-China relations. Leaders are talking about it openly and candidly. We also witnessed increased regional cooperation on capacity building and the efforts to reduce the incidents at sea. And interesting to me, we see China's effort to conduct a big wave of internationalization of the South China Sea that was unlike before. We see it in China's efforts to enlist some countries supporting its position with regard to arbitration case. So South China Sea has become an international issue, a case in point of action-reaction chain toward escalation, and with the complexity and uncertainty. And the third part of my presentation is about the impact to the regional and strategic landscape. We see the arm build-up. Regional countries are engaged in modernization of weapon systems. We also see together with the acquisition of arms and weapon modernization, as well as the militarization of the reclaimed areas, more chances for incidents at sea. We know that the misfire of the Taiwanese rocket is the case in point. We also are concerned about the big powers politics related to South China Sea. And again, the continued concern is about the role of ASEAN, whether ASEAN has reduced its central role, the ASEAN's cohesion has been eroded. It is still an open question. And more importantly, I think the impact is seen in the trust deficit that has been growing. Actually, since the first half of 2016, the incidence of Chinese harassment against Vietnamese fishermen was actually reduced. And that fact was seen not in a positive way because of the lack of trust. People seem to see that China is changing the tactic, or China has become a little bit more quiet in the anticipation of the PCA ruling, and we see it. Some in Vietnam see it as something like respite before a bigger storm. Equally worrisome is about the impacts to the domestic politics in the regional countries. We see it happening in the Philippines with the new presidents coming into the office. We see some countries hardening their position with regard to the territorial disputes, and the domestic politics at the same time are divided on how to cope with China. So I must say that moderate and balanced views in some countries are discouraged by Chinese actions. My last part is about what to expect as the next moves or next things to happen, like Dr. Ding was talking about the Act 2. I would like to think that the rulings we had this morning would open a new action and reaction chain. we would expect all the countries changing the strategy or adjusting the policies in the light of the rulings. And I would like to think that I would agree with Dr. Ding in his comments that it would open up two possibilities. One, China can be harder, or two, China can become somehow softer. But I would like to think that China would continue to do what it is doing now, and even we have to expect some more harsh actions, including the introduction of the ADIZ or the land reclamation around and in the Scarborough area. And that would also include the harsh treatment against fishermen in the region, and that would lead to the reaction by other countries, including the ASEAN claimants and the non-claimants in ASEAN, as well as the US, Japan, and other countries. And that would lead us to lingering questions that we are trying to answer, and we are not successful on that. And I would like to introduce some of the questions, and I would like to hear the comments from especially Chinese participants here. So what China really wants in South China Sea? Who called the shots in China with regard to policy implementation with regard to South China Sea? Is it? How does China link South China Sea with its policy with regard to ASEAN, and especially with the US? And it seems to me now that the ball is now on China's court, and we really want to see how China would react to that. So I would end my presentation here, and thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks, Tom. Our next speaker is Alina Noor, who is the Director of Foreign Policy and Strategy Studies at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in KL. Elena?
Thanks, Murray. And also, generally, thank you to CSIS for giving me this opportunity to be here. Let me try to do two things in the short time that I have. With the usual applicable disclaimers, my view is only one of many Malaysians who may have differing views from me. And I'm also a non-official, so don't take this as a government position. I will, however, in the first instance, try to clarify Malaysia's official position and address the frustration and exasperation frequently expressed by outside observers of Malaysia's stance. And then secondly, I'd like to offer some thoughts on the way forward post this morning's tribunal decision. So first of all, Malaysia's position. Malaysia has been called a number of things: flaky, spineless, especially pre-tribunal, mostly by parties hoping to extract stronger statements from Malaysia with regard to the South China Sea dispute. The reality is that if you are looking for Malaysia to draw a red line in the sand, and you'll have to excuse my mixed metaphors, that will simply not happen. It's true that Malaysia prizes its relationship with China. It's true that Malaysia enjoys very close economic ties with this neighboring giant. It is also true that the South China Sea is but one component of this bilateral relationship. And therefore, Malaysia takes the South China Sea dispute with China and other countries in that context. Ideally, the Malaysian government would not want the overlapping claims in the South China Sea to cast a long and dark shadow over these excellent ties. But there are, as Ambassador Nguyen has already alluded to, there have been developments closer to home, to Malaysia, that has given rise to increasingly serious, if not grave, concerns about the strategic landscape and the implications of these developments to Malaysia. These include, among other things, the intrusion of foreign vessels into our EEZ, sorry, British education, the construction of artificial islands and the placement of military assets on some of these artificial islands. If you recall, there was also a 4-point consensus maneuver sometime in May with Brunei, Cambodia, and Laos, which I think some observers found quite bizarre, given that China has always said that it wants to exclude non-claimants in discussions of the dispute. And recently, as we've all read, there was that huge debacle in Kunming. The official Malaysian line, as has been reiterated numerous times in the Malaysian Parliament, has been that the South China Sea issue rests fundamentally on the freedoms of navigation and overflight, as provided for by UNCLOS, and on the overlapping claims by parties to the dispute. Malaysia, along with other ASEAN claimants, is and has been very clear from the very beginning of its rejection of the 9-line claim. Today, the tribunal validated the absence of a legal basis for that claim. I would urge that when you are trying to understand the Malaysian position, don't look for drama, look for nuances. So this means that even though there are going to be occasionally paradoxical comments in the media that sometimes appear to conflict with each other, there is a measure of method to this madness, believe it or not. So, for example, look for the fact that as early on as 2011, and even prior to that, senior officials were already voicing concern about developments in the South China Sea, which was probably unheard of for Malaysia about 10 years ago. Look for the fact that Malaysian political leaders, incensed by the brazenly frequent and semi-permanent intrusions into Malaysia's EEZ since 2013, abandoned the convention of not publicizing these feelings and the dispute in the media, and instead went to social media, which is arguably much, much worse than the mainstream media in terms of exposing these intrusions. Look for the fact that in view of these intrusions, Malaysia stepped up its frequency of its patrols in the area of these intrusions to nearly every single day of the year last year. Look for the fact also that the dispute has been frequently and regularly raised and debated in Parliament among members of Parliament who are not typically very much interested in regional or strategic affairs. This year alone, the South China Sea has been tabled for discussion in Parliament every month in the last 3 consecutive months. That's a lot in the Malaysian context. And then if we go back a little last year, you'll recall that when Malaysia was chair of ASEAN, Malaysia released chairman statements that were quite strong during the ASEAN Summit as well as the East Asia Summit. Those statements each contain 5 paragraphs relating to the South China Sea. And Malaysia also released chairman statements with about 2 paragraphs each on the South China Sea right after the ASEAN-China Summit and the ASEAN-US Summit. So I think it says quite a bit about how Malaysia feels and how its position has changed very subtly over the years. Now, secondly, what next? Investing Wind has done an excellent job of covering some of the options. I just want to offer you these. First of all, Malaysia has stood ready to try and resolve and manage the dispute in any way possible, including negotiations. It has not actually set aside bilateral or multilateral approaches as possibilities, as long as they are done peacefully and in accordance with international law. I expect Malaysia will continue with this position, and I expect it will continue to press adherence to the declaration conduct and for the expeditious conclusion of a legally binding COC within the ASEAN framework. My own personal view is that in reality, both the letter and the spirit of the DOC has already been severely violated, particularly with all the construction that has been taking place over the years. But pressing for the continuation of the COC is something that must be done at the official level. Now for ASEAN, the tribunal is an excellent validation of the institution and significance of international law, which Malaysia has always expressed preparedness to abide by. You'll recall that Malaysia went to court to the ICJ twice with its neighbors, and it's worked well for them. We haven't won in every single instance, but we have continued to press for adherence to it. And the tribunal decision is an important clarifying reference point from which we should start Act 2, Act 3, and continue with. It will be important to take this decision as a way forward with negotiations within ASEAN, and hopefully allow ASEAN to consolidate its position both privately and publicly in different settings. And hopefully it will allow ASEAN, in doing so, to restore some of the credibility that's been lost over the past year. The rhetoric and reality of its pronouncements of unity and centrality have not always been public for the world to see. So it's an opportunity for ASEAN to speak with one voice. It's also an opportunity for the claimant states to restore some meaning to the DOC beyond just talk. I'll stop right here because I'd like to allow more conversation between us. So thank you for listening.
Great. Thanks, Alina. Then thanks to all four panelists. I'm going to open up the floor now to questions. If you want to, I'll recognize you and then wait for a microphone and identify yourself. So we'll go to this table over here.
Hi, my name is Hong. I'm a student at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I wanted to ask, because of the historical conflict between China and Vietnam, and because of the, not just territory, but the natural resources that's in the region, is it possible for Vietnam and China, because China and the US have, the US is a large world power, but Vietnam's a little bit different. Is there a possibility for a truly peaceful negotiation? And what would specifically have to happen for that to happen?
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do what Bonnie set a good example, take 3 questions and then let our panelists answer. So, sir.
Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. A question primarily for Dr. Shen. From the Chinese perspective, which is obviously very different from the sort of US-Philippine perspective, what are the range of options for President Xi responding going forward? What, given both the Chinese understanding of the law and the Chinese understanding of the history, the historical rights, and of, frankly, national pride and sovereignty, what are the kinds of things that Beijing could reasonably do in response to this decision?
So, Richard.
Thank you. Great panel. I'm Richard Cronin from the Stimpson Center. I have a question that may end up going more towards Mike Mcdevitt, but others may, I hope others will weigh in. One is, what are the implications of this tribunal ruling for the U.S.-Philippines alliance in terms of, does it change anything in terms of, for instance, if a Chinese vessel sinks a Philippine official vessel, Navy, Coast Guard, et cetera? But then, more broadly, this issue of freedom navigation exercises, I've been annoyed by all the talk about within 12 miles thing, because I think the mere mention of 12 miles gives some significance to these Chinese artificial reefs or islands. So for freedom of navigation, are we going to, do you think that the U.S. will still be talking about, or the Navy, about within 12 miles on any of these features because now they're patently they're patently illegal in terms of generating any maritime space, except for a safety zone.
So I'll let our panelists decide who wants to take which questions, but who would like to start?
There are two questions I can handle. One is if China and Vietnam can truly peacefully negotiate to settle their dispute. Yes. For instance, they used to unfortunately fought against each other in 1980. And they negotiated peacefully, giving and taking. China said, you take this land of mine. Vietnam said, you take my land of this. They trade. They succeed. Now they resolve permanently for good. And in Beibu湾, Tonkin Bay, because Vietnam got the island that used to be on the Chinese side of the deleted two dash line. So per UNCLOS, Vietnam may claim more maritime rights, but that might be unreasonable for China to accept. The two countries negotiate to agree that Vietnam may take a little more than 50% of the entire area, and China take some 40% plus. This is the way, taking and giving. The challenge is how to apply this spirit in more difficult area within the overlapped area between 9-dash line and Vietnam's EEZ. Vietnam said, no way, that's the UN law. China said, that's my historical rights. And today, the court say the rights may not be valid. Well, why we must listen to the court if we are friends? China used to delete 2 lines. We don't need to stick to the 2 lines. When Vietnam says, you are my friend, you can go to limited overlapping area with strict courts and pay some fee. So this is not disallowed by UNCLOS. But that had to be negotiated between the 2 sides. Some may disagree. But a country, China may say, I would relinquish my EEZ rights to allow some other country to enter. UNCLOS would not demand China, you cannot relinquish your rights. It's all up to negotiation. So arbitration and mediation and negotiation, all these 3 TION provide us opportunity. So let's see how we can work out. I hope we can have a happy actor too.
All right, can I? Yeah.
Well, I was going to let Tom speak because it's directly related.
Okay, I have something on that point too.
Okay.
I'd like to respond a bit about the comments by Dr. Ding. The negotiation on the Tonkin Gulf actually is based on UNCLOS principles. So that fact is recognized, and it serves as the foundation for negotiation. And we all know that during the negotiation, some compromises have been made, and the compromises has been made is based on the question of trust and political will. And we did have this kind of thing before when we negotiated the Tonkin Gulf, and we do not have them right now. That is the issue. I'd like to mention also about the recognition of law from the small country like Vietnam, of course, as compared with China. So the law is the weapon for the small country to cope with the big country. And I think that it is the basic approach of Vietnam with regard to negotiation on the territorial disputes, both on the land and on the sea.
On the resource issue, one of the things that it strikes me that the findings that we heard about today may make joint development easier throughout the Spratlys. First of all, by essentially legally erasing the 9-dash line, you don't have a problem with overlap in the EEZ there. Secondly, by saying that none of the Spratlys are an island, they're all rocks. There are only 12-mile sovereignty claims around those that are above water at high tide. That means there are no EEZs and hence no EEZ overlaps. And one of the issues that China has always had on the table is we are willing to do joint development, absolutely. But the precondition was you have to agree that China has sovereignty. Well, it may not make any difference now. Who cares if China has sovereignty over a rock that only has a 12-mile territorial sea, if the issue is joint development of oil or what have you in fields more broadly. So my point is by turning those Spratlys into nothing but rocks, thereby eliminating a Spratly EEZ, thereby eliminating the problem of overlapping EEZs from Spratly features to continental states, and thereby and by removing the 9-dash line, that clarifies a lot of things that can make it easier for the countries that are competing for sovereignty over those features to put aside sovereignty and get on with joint development in a way that heretofore was not possible. To Richard's point on innocent passage, or freedom of navigation, it's important to understand that innocent passage is one of an important high seas freedom, and thereby passing within. You have to pass within 12 miles. In other words, you have to transit somebody's territorial sea to make it innocent passage. And so I think the senator mentioned we should immediately do a freedom of navigation op around Mischief Reef. Well, part of the problem that the government has faced is China has not heretofore made any official claims on what maritime entitlements are associated with the Spratly Islands. They've been silent on all of those points. And so the only thing left, it's hard to challenge an excessive claim when an excessive claim has not been made. And so the only thing to challenge was do an innocent passage freedom of navigation. And so now arguably the law says that Mischief Reef does not have or is not a rock. It is definitely for sure, no kidding, a low tide elevation. So in theory, we could sail within 500 meters. You also asked what are the implications for the Mutual Defense Treaty. It strikes me the one thing that we have to be concerned about is if a literal reading of the law would say that China is now illegally occupying Mischief Reef, which is part of the Philippine continental shelf. So one would hope the Philippines is not going to try to evict the Chinese from Mischief Reef. But the point is, now would the treaty come into play because legally that has now been declared essentially Philippine territory. And so these are really interesting. Arguably, Second Thomas Shoal falls into that same sort of a category. And so these are interesting problems that our State Department lawyers have to sort out.
Well, Ambassador Tung mentioned that due to the lack of trust and political will, China and Vietnam now have some difficulty in negotiating. Mike mentioned that China used the excuse of territorial sovereignty to justify its demand of co-development. As the island is small, territorial water is small, so China uses a small bargain for a bigger return. I would say, if it's a bargain, and China 2 years ago submitted a set of documents of 12 pieces of document that Vietnam used to say in a way that Spratland Plaza belonged to China. Prior to 1975, Vietnam created some document of such. So why Vietnam could negate its commitment? Vietnam's leader told Deng Xiaoping because they have succeeded in defeating America, they no longer need China's help. Or they would say that used to be committed by the previous government, which no longer exists. That commitment was given without parliament ratification. Well, these were all reasons, but not a perfect reason. And Vietnam have reclaimed over such a disputed island. Well, if I were Chinese leader, I would say I would not enter the disputed water to fish, but I want all and each and all island back and build my outpost, not reclaiming a lot, even though Vietnam has reclaimed. Vietnam would be very painful to do the trading. So that's why China has proposed, in principle, sharing territorial sovereign dispute, but co-develop. But China has not managed to proposing an enticing proposal in what limited area to co-develop, in what majority of the overlapped area not to co-develop, which island return, which majority island not return. So China need to improve how to invent and sell a package which would win the heart and build the trust and the willingness. China need to improve. But I would say, they keep some island, and we have limited access not to the entirety of the overlapped water, still is a worthy proposal for all claimants to consider.
Unfortunately, our time is up for this panel. The problem is we have to get a bunch of you, a lot of people, through the lunch line, and that at 1:15, Daniel Crittenbrink of the National Security Council is going to come and give a talk. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you for chairing.